Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio Pais.
And today we're talking about subtypes.
Yes, in a very specific way, because we're going to cover foundational things about subtypes. And we are doing this because right now we are talking a lot between the two of us and studying even more of that because we're getting ready for a course that will start this week. Actually, on Tuesday, the 23rd, right? The 23rd, I think, and of January. We are recording this. No, on 24th of January, Tuesday. And we are recording this in January 2023. We'll teach an interesting workshop on subtypes that it will be different than others we have taught. So super happy to enjoy this time on the podcast, talking with you more about the theme.
Right. Now, of course, we've talked about subtypes before, and we will again. But today we wanted to talk specifically, kind of at a very foundational level, about what are subtypes exactly? How do they operate? Why are they so important in our view? And of course, this is always a prelude. This understanding of how subtypes operate is a necessary foundation for using knowledge of subtypes and, of course, your own subtype to grow. And we believe that subtypes are one of the biggest leverage points in the Enneagram. And part of that is because they usually point to the behaviors that we engage in that are the most unconscious and at the same time happening all the time. So this is why one of the reasons why we think subtypes are so important. What's another thing you want to say about subtypes at the get-go here that's maybe slightly new or different than what we've talked about before, or maybe more, what would be more exact is to say building on what we've talked about before?
I feel very motivated to do this podcast. And I think I'll answer this question of you as we go, because I believe there are many things that people don't really understand when it comes to subtypes. And I intend, if you allow me to be a little bit critical with of things that have been said over time about subtypes. And in doing that, I think I'll explain what I see that's foundational and important and that needs to be understood by you, our listener, who wants to do serious inner work on this particular part of the psyche that is the subtype.
Yeah, and I think another thing to say about all this that you just said is that, I come from an academic background. And one of the things that sometimes frustrates me in the Enneagram world, especially now that the Enneagram is getting so popular and spread in so many different ways, often ways that I think you and I believe might be a little too shallow or superficial. But one of the things that's really important is that always seeing sort of the forefront of Enneagram knowledge and understandings, and therefore uh, growth opportunities. We're always seeing that we need to be evolving our understanding, I think, to make it more and more precise so that it can be effective when we're using the Enneagram for inner work. Because I hear a lot of different Enneagram theories out there, and I always want to say, well, does that really work for you? How's that going for you? You may repeat this theory. And again, to be honest, sometimes it's a theory that I don't really buy into or that I don't really see as being very central or important. Um, so on the one hand, we believe we kind of are making an argument for the centrality of subtypes in using the Enneagram for inner work. But also for me as an academic, I'm always asking the question, are we on the right track? How are we building on the right foundation of knowledge so that our knowledge keeps growing and evolving and we keep doing better and better inner work? Because we have a more and more accurate or precise or just effective theory that we're working with. And I think this is why evolving subtype theory and practices that come from good theory is something that's so important to us. And we're always asking the question, what more do we need to know or understand, or how can we see this in a different way or communicate it in a different way so that people can get the most out of the Enneagram when they're applying it to understand themselves.
Yeah, I believe that a good work when it comes to theory and even a more scientific approach needs to consider the empiric realm and the empiricism in general. I believe that perhaps when we teach the subtypes, people have one of the biggest aha moments. And when we work with those, it really works. People get better more quickly. And it's amazing to see how the patterns work. So, if there is something working there really, really well, then let's take it seriously and study it further. So, as you're saying, yeah, we need more studies. We need to be in solid ground. But, it's extremely important to see what good subtype work does to people and how effective it is to recognize my own subtype, one's own subtype, and observe a few patterns that are related to this. And I'll explain more the thing about the masks and subtype, meaning sub of what, is something I would like to talk about. And yeah, so let's start, B. I don't know where you want to start.
Right. Well, it might be good to start with, getting a really good definition of subtype. And maybe also, I guess I want to say another thing that motivates me in this discussion, as often does when we're working with the Enneagram, is my own experience of discovering my subtype for the first time.
Mm,
I studied the Enneagram for about 14 years before I learned the approach to the subtypes we use, which comes from Claudio Naranjo, and what I think is his sort of additional many years of theorizing after the original subtype definitions leaked out from his teaching, maybe in the 70s and 80s. In 2004, you and I were at a conference where he taught this approach, and he talked about these 27 subtypes that we mainly use. Now, we don't align with Naranjo 100%, that might be said, and I think you differ with him in specific ways, and we can talk about that. But I think it is good just to kind of define our terms, that we're talking about um, the 27 subtypes. There are 9 Enneagram types. The idea that there are 3 versions or subtypes, but you can say more about that in a moment, of each of the 9 types based on which one of 3 instinctual drives, kind of generalized instinctual focuses or goals, are most dominant. And those 3 instincts, generally speaking, are for one that focuses attention on self-preservation in a basic sense. Can I survive? Am I safe? Do I have what I need? Do I have the structure and resources to feel like I'm okay? The social instinct, which puts attention more on the collective or the group, or one's relationship to others in a group or in the collective, can be a family, a team, um, or society or humanity. All of those things can fall under this sort of social instinct focus. And last is sexual, which is about a kind of one to one fusion or bonding, a kind of often more competitive energy, the energy of rivalry that's about winning out that significant other, and merging or fusing with that person in a deep way. Again, all of these things to support survival. So those are the 3 instincts. When we combine a dominant focus on one of those instincts with especially the passion of the type, which is the core of the type in terms of especially motivation, the lower emotional center. When we merge those two, what we get is um, a lot of behavioral patterns that are very automatic, uh, almost like those resorted to in times of emergency when survival is threatened, which can be all the time for some people. But the subtype focus or behaviors or patterns tend to be the most unconscious, in part because they are coming from our instinctual center mixed up with our lower emotional center, especially in the form of the passion of the type. And of course, we've talked a lot about the passion as a real central factor, what Gurdjieff called the chief feature of the type. And so you get 27 types, each with its own focus, but three subversions of each of the nine types, to the point where sometimes it's hard to even talk about like one kind of six or a type one or a type seven, because the three subtypes of that type have such distinct differences that even their growth paths can be kind of the opposite. So understanding this is really key. And for me, um, my inner growth path completely got changed when I learned my subtype in 2004, even though I'd been studying the Enneagram for 14 years. And for me, I learned things about myself that not only I hadn't been seeing, but that I really, really, really didn't want to see or admit to or own, much less work with. But when I really focused on them and learned about them and observed myself, I had to admit that they were really true. Things like, being childlike, needing to grow up, throwing tantrums when I got angry instead of just simply being angry in a more adult way. Things that I did, all kinds of things that, it's humiliating to even say this, that I noticed myself doing that were much different than the normal type 2 stuff, the type 2 umbrella term and all the characteristics that go along with that. It was so much different for me when I saw that I was a self preservation too. And so this is one of the reasons why we focus on this a lot, is it's almost like when you work with the nine types, you're sort of working with a blunt instrument, like, trying to do surgery with a butter knife instead of a scalpel. So that's I think something I want to say about why this is important and what we're talking about in terms of getting in there and understanding what's going on when we talk about subtype. What are we addressing, and what is the alchemy between the instinctual center and the heart, the lower emotional heart center, uh, that really produces the subtype characteristics?
Nice. Thank you for all this good intro, B. And I want to say also that we have previous episodes here on our Enneagram 2.0 podcast that refer to subtypes and also one to instinct. Episode number 4, subtypes, episode number 11, instincts. And we've been talking about this all along in many, many other episodes. But I believe your first question was super interesting, at least for me as a social five. And the question was, what are subtypes really? And I want to offer a few explanations that we not always talk about. So, the first thing, I want to build a context here. Okay. I remember, B, once in a conference, an Enneagram conference, many, many years ago, I was having a talk, one of those side talks that I love, with someone I deeply respect, and that's Russ Hudson. And he's a friend, very, a very big respect for him. And he said something about, I don't like to call subtypes because they are not subtype of anything. That's what he said. And I understood first that it was his perspective when teaching about instincts more than subtypes, and also differently from the narrative tradition of Helen Palmer and David Daniels. And okay, it's Russ's position. And, in here, in our podcast and in our teachings, we always have the commitment to saying what we agree with, what we don't agree with. And whenever we do that, it's not personal. And especially with someone like Russ that we admire so much. So I want to say that I disagree with Russ right now. So I do believe that the subtypes are a subtype of something specific. And what is it? It's the passion. To me, the subtypes could even be called subpassions. And that is something I would like to explain. So we have, and I don't know how Enneagram authors that don't really take into account spirituality can work with this without having this concept. So we have a higher self. And we have, for instance, something that is called the virtue associated to our type, coming from a higher self when we are more in touch with essence. And the virtue comes from what is called a higher emotional center. It's a higher level emotion. And as it happens with everybody, as we live our lives, we disconnect from that and we fall down to lower centers of intelligence and we lose touch with those higher centers of intelligence. And when we lose touch with the higher emotional center, in which one of the things is the virtue, this higher level emotion, then we go to the lower emotional center, in which there is the passion. And the passion, as we have explained thoroughly here on Enneagram 2.0 already, is a very central thing to define personality. The passion is perhaps the most central thing. 9 passions, one for each type, and we really advocate that we don't have 2 or 3 passions, only one. We have all 9 emotions, but just one becomes so addictive that we call it a passion. And that passion runs the show in many ways. It runs the show, for instance, in how we feel everything in life. It kidnaps all the emotional space and experience. We don't feel other stuff because the passion is just taking over all the heart, all the emotional experience, and it's ever present. But then, for obvious reasons, we can't see that. We cannot see that much if we are to keep living in ego. So, the process of losing awareness, which is actually the process of coming to this world and becoming a functional human, this process, which is archetypal, implies not being conscious totally about that passion. So we need to have it running the show without us being totally aware, and even more without us being frustrated at it, right? And this is why when we do this very hard thing called inner work, we need to get back to observing the passion and feeling more and more frustrated at it, which is daring to fight those more human constructs that make us live here in the world and so forth. So again, the passion is important from the perspective of living daily life, having an identity, and having some strengths that come from the passion, and having to cope with weaknesses that come from it also, right? It's important on that level. But if you are interested in inner work, on going beyond your daily life and trying to reach up to higher levels and to dare to question what is there beyond my daily life, then you need to challenge your passion. But you have fallen into a sub passion. You have developed an even more radical form of being and limiting form of being, which is a specific way how that passion manifests for you. You
Or
have
maybe a limiting form of non-being.
exactly, good point. So it's a particular way that we lose consciousness of the passion and consciousness in general, and we detach from being itself, which is more the connection to essence, that higher realm, right? So the sub passion or subtype is a particular way when in our heart we go even lower in level of experience in the heart. If we are in full touch with the passion, we are still at least experiencing the heart somehow, and we are just not giving space for other emotions. But going to the subtype means numbing out the heart itself, or and going to a very minor part of the use of the heart, which is much closer to the belly and not only to the heart, which is the instinct realm. So instincts and subtypes are not the same thing, as we explained in previous episodes. So sometimes we explain this by saying the passion is the mask of the virtue when we fall down and lose that in touch with that higher self. And then what is the subtype? It's the mask of that mask. It's the second mask. It's the mask of that passion. It's actually even meant to make us not see the passion and not own it and not feel the pain that it brings to us, because no passion is pleasant if we are really in touch with it more consciously all the time. So the subtype is a buffer, and Gurdjieff used to talk a lot about buffers, meaning that we need to work on the buffers to be able to grow. What are the buffers that exist in me that prevent me from feeling the pain? I need to get rid of those. And I'd say one of the main buffers is your subtype, if not the main one. It's a buffer for you not to own, not to see, not to experience the passion of your type. So I don't know if you want to comment, because I want to give an example, but I really want to hear from you first if you wish.
Yeah, I guess I would just, I think you've said so much. I just want to sort of restate and clarify some of the things you said, because in case people aren't with us so far, right? I think these buffers are so important. I remember reading Gurdjieff and reading about Gurdjieff's work and how central buffers were. And I think this is a great word because it really helps us understand how, as we go through our human lives, we're constantly um, our psyche finds ways to defend us from feeling what's really happening. Like Gurdjieff also would talk a lot about how we lie to ourselves a lot, little lies all the time to make ourselves feel better. I think that's a different kind of form of buffer, right? So that's one thing, is that the passion, in a way, part of the reason why it exists and the reason why it's unconscious is that it is the core of suffering. It's the source of suffering, but it's also something that we kind of get seduced into a certain way of thinking about things that make us not feel the pain of what we're really experiencing in everyday life. Like for me, pride makes it so, oh, I can sort of think a little bit better about myself in every kind of way, instead of maybe feeling a certain pain of what might not be true of myself when I puff myself up in terms of pride, making me see myself a little bit better than I am, or see myself as more important or more useful than I really am in a certain situation. It's so I don't have to feel the pain of a given situation. And of course, one of the things I want to point out is the way of growth for us humans is through feeling pain,
Yeah.
right? One of my favorite C.S. Lewis quotes is pain is God's megaphone to a deaf world. Conscious suffering is one of the key ways we make progress on the path of self development. Being willing to face our core wounding, our hurts, our pains is the way we move through them and eventually ease that pain. But of course, in everyday life, the automatic thing is to rely on these unconscious buffers. And I think the subtype and the passion are ways of kind of living in an illusion and not really being in touch with the reality of what's happening at a deeper level. And of course, when we do get in touch with that reality, then we can deal with it and get better. So I just wanted to also clarify the mask. When you say the passion is the mask of the virtue, the idea is that when we sort of fall from a higher place into this human realm, one of the things that happens is we lose touch with the higher realm and the higher virtues, humility, veracity, all the higher virtues, and we fall down into the opposite of our particular virtue. So as a two, I lose touch with humility when I come into this human life and fall into pride. And then I'm acting out pride all the time in ways that I don't see. So, of course, a big thing we emphasize is becoming aware of the passion, because then again, you're getting more in touch with reality. You're getting more in touch with the sources of your pain that you habitually defend against. And then, so saying the subtype is the mask of the subtype is the way we go unconscious in everyday life to the ongoing functioning of the passion by getting focused on certain specific things. And so at your subtype will show you the more specific things that you focus on to not be aware of your passion.
Yeah, yeah, I fully agree with all of that. And the subtype for me, B, is a particularly comfortable thing to be in touch with, because being in touch with a passion is very uncomfortable for all nine passions. It's not comfortable if we are really living it in its fullest state. And if we go lower, in this indirect manifestation of the passion, which is actually a sub passion, in which I won't be as aware of that passion existing, I'll feel comfort, and I'll be okay. I'll relax into that state, which is very unaware, but at the same time, it feels good, right? And sometimes, unfortunately, what makes us humans feel good is something that is very far away from truth and very unevolved points of being. So, particularly comfortable thing that is therefore designed to stop that suffering that you very well reminded us that should be felt in order for us to grow. No pain, no gain, and no pain, no growth here. Another thing that you said that, I want to add something, is that to me, the subtype is one of the most passionate parts of the passion, if not the main one. It's something that is very intense. When we are into subtype territory, we feel like, woo, very taken by that in our lives. And it's like where we find finally our identity that can make us be someone in life and feel good about ourselves, and even like feel superior unconsciously, feel like I'm well on the scene and everything is going well, in a way that we are pretending that everything's fine. Like we are trying to live in an illusion when we are coming from subtype, an illusion that all is fine. And things, no, they are not fine if we're coming from that lower level of awareness. Another thing is that
Right,
it's,
but not trying to live in again, it's unconscious.
yeah, very unconscious, but it's what the
We are in
personality is
the
trying.
illusion.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Right.
There are better ways to say that, but I think you got the point. And it's also a particularly stubborn part of our psyche. We are less willing to negotiate the letting go of the subtype, because it's a very important part of our defenses against feeling pain, and so we are not willing to let that go.
And I think it's also something we don't wanna let go of is the main strategy we've found for making things happen, right? Like, I'm thinking of, because I think one of the things that's been amazing to me as we do, like, deep inner work retreats where we work with people, is sometimes what we're trying to do when we work with people is help them see this subtype pattern that they really don't see and don't want to see, and push back hard. Like if we're trying to see, help a self-preservation force see how they're masochistically like inflicting pain, it's a little bit the opposite of some people think they're trying to get away from, some people are trying to get away from pain. Self-preservation force have a high pain tolerance. I'm remembering when we're trying to help people see the subtype pattern, there's a lot of resistance to seeing these patterns in all of us. So it's almost like my subtype is a way, it's sort of like the solution that my ego's found to get along in life and to create, to live in that illusion that everything's great and I have control. You know, we often say that the ego, when we're in ego, it's like we're playing God. We've figured out how to control everything. And so we're just doubling down on that plan and that strategy. And it's hard to let go of that. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that I think that's what we're talking about here when we're saying the subtype is the main way we live in an illusion and keep that whole thing going. And when someone points it out to us, we really don't want to see it. Not only because it hurts like our pride, or it hurts, um, it goes against how we want to see ourselves, but also it would undo the survival strategy that many of us have, and the very particular survival strategy.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like the subtype is trying to create us an identity and define a little bit, that we are something in this world that will be valuable, will be seen, creating a self that is very strong, a profile of who I am. And at the same time, we need to understand this is our personality wanting us to be something instead of just being who we are.
And I want to point out that some traditions call that the small self, right? So we want to be somebody, but really what we want to be ends up being this small self, this ego self, which is actually quite fragile.
Yeah, sorry. When we want to be something, it's because we are not satisfied with just being itself, and we feel like we need to be important, and that pushes us away from inner work. Inner work implies not wanting to be anything and being interested in this other thing that already exists independently of me, called being, being itself. So going above, rising above the subtype means I don't want to stick with that particular identity that brought me comfort and that made me be very stubborn. And the last thing I want to say before providing an example is it's one of the most mechanical parts of all of our personality. It's really compulsive and insistent in being a certain way all the time, and that's because in the heart space there are layers of things that are happening there, or what Gurdjieff called portions, and that's the most mechanical portion of the heart, the subtype. We used to call it the moving portion of the lower emotional center. But don't mind the terminology that Gurdjieff used that is a little bit complicated to understand right now, although very useful and interesting. What you need to know is it's the most mechanical part of the heart, most like automated part that is all the time doing the same and not allowing for space. And it's important to say then that the heart kidnaps the energy of the dominant instinct that's behind there, and the dominant instinct kidnaps the energy of the heart. So there is a mutual robbery happening. One is stealing energy from the other and producing a big confusion inside that will prevent us from growing. So I don't know if I should go ahead and give an example then, B.
You've been threatening to for a while, so go ahead.
Well, I'm threatening myself because I'm going to give an example of type 5, my own type. So,
I was hoping you would say that.
yes. So, okay. So, how do I see the subtypes of 5, not in the terms that we generally describe them, but more in terms of how is the passion of 5 behind each of those three subtypes of 5? And how are the subtypes sub passions? How can I explain that? So let's remember what the passion of 5s is. It's called avarice. And avarice is a shutting down of the heart for receiving, for giving, and using less and less and less of the heart. Also facilitated by the defense mechanism of isolation, in which 5s disconnect from the heart and go to the head, right? So the heart for 5s, it's like avarice is a force to use less and less and less of the heart, to feel each time less. When 5s are in touch with avarice, they disconnect from the heart each time more. And in a relationship, for instance, they go a bit more far away, and then more far away, and then more far away. They build more boundaries, more obstacles in between, and they end up just not feeling anything in the relationship. I've been there many times in my life, and it's very sad. But it also brings comfort for a 5, because then I don't suffer. I don't need to feel all that I'm missing, and I don't need to have expectations that unavoidably will not be met, and so forth. So that's a little bit the passion of avarice, among many other things that we could say. And there are episodes that we recorded about passions, but also about 5s and each type. You can review those if you want. But then there are the subtypes. The self-preservation subtype of 5 becomes very much distant, also in the physical way, like making oneself unavailable and retreating to a very private territory. It's the avarice of being alone, really alone, almost literally, and not communicating, not sharing any kind of information about myself, not inviting you up to my space, and having a fortress in between you and I, and having walls that protect me, very very thick and tall and high walls. So where is the passion of avarice in there? Okay, so look, it's interesting to see that self-preservation 5s, when they are inside that castle, they feel very comfortable, and they even feel like they are expanded in their sensation of being. They feel that they can have everything they need, and they have the comfort of being all they can be within those walls. So it's like I won't see that I am retreating for all the rest of the world if I feel that castle as a whole and being a big thing. It's almost like I have made the castle become the whole planet. and I don't feel this lack of expansion. But the lack of expansion is in the very fact that the castle is not even a grain of sand in the beach. It's less than that. It's so little in terms of all that I can live, all that I can experience in life, and I have disconnected from everything outside, and even more so from unexpected things that can come my way. And I want to say things and not people, because for fives there is a risk that people become things, right? So the self-preservation five is in total avarice when being inside that castle. I can only open my heart if nobody's invading my territory, if I have all the control, if I know the weather, the climate, the things that will happen, who's inside, who isn't inside, what, so it's very much like trying to have the control over my life, my space, my territory as Everest. And there is a lot, the word I and mine in that, which is always very ego driven. So it's me, and everything else is not part of my world. And that's a lot what Everest is. Now, for socials like me, social fives, the avarice is behind the totem. That is the usual word we use to describe what the social five subtype is. Totem is a representation of a community, society, collectivity in terms of culture, values, interests, knowledge produced, and so forth. That piece of wood with inscriptions and carvings on it that show symbols, icons, and representations of all that has been produced and what that community is about. So social fives try to belong to one of those communities and have their names carved in that wood, in that the totem is made of. And they also try to feel part of all of that. And then when that's happening, well, fives feel expanded. Social fives feel that, wow, I belong. And they can even be very spontaneous and very free, funny, and outgoing when they feel that they have written their names in the books belonging to that society. And it's even more interesting if it's a secret society. Now, that the thing is, that sensation of expansion is completely delusional, because it's a very well controlled space, not too different from what the self press 5 does in that castle in a more literal way. It's similar in terms of controlling how I feel in that more abstract community or group or realm of influence. And I feel super well, as if I am very expanded, as if I am very free and communicative, even outgoing, and so forth. And I feel good, as if I didn't have avarice. But where is the avarice? The avarice is in the fact that I have left everybody else outside the totem, and I don't connect to them, and I see them as being inferior beings. And I have left also some people inside the totem in the lower part of the hierarchy inside that group. So I try to walk up on the totem to be important and to be in a position of power. That's a very big risk for a social five. All social fives go with that. Yes.
And you're also the social five, at least to how I experience, also goes much relates to the group and everything else completely through the head. So there's a sort of a lessening of experience of the heart, as if that's a kind of inferior function, and as if the intellect is omnipotent, because that shared values and expertise and knowledge happens all through the head.
That's super correct. And at the same time, it might be confusing because five, social fives in that totem feel a lot of energy, intensity, and they may mistake that for emotion. It's not emotion though. It's a lot of intensity that our subtype, whatever it is, brings us all the time. So we feel a lot of intensity. As I said, the most passionate part of the passion. So the social fives feel all of that as part of instinct, but there's no emotional connection there. And they need to see that the coldness that all fives risk developing in their lives is growing bigger and bigger and bigger, and they get a little bit like utilitarian even in how they relate with people. Is this people going to bring me any kind of good information? Then they are useful. If not, I push them away and I don't even see them, and I don't value them at all. So it's a mechanism that make them feel good superficially. And this is what the subtype is. It makes us feel good superficially. And we are not leaving our true path of fulfillment. Now, the sexual five develops a very particular emotionality that they express many times, at least for some, in the form of art, in the form of poetry, or in the form of how they express what they are feeling to that significant other, for instance. And they feel like they are deep, they are emotional. It feels very emotional indeed, but in reality, it's manipulation of the emotional exchange. It's like, I am giving you this and I'm expecting so much in in return. And I believe that the sexual five is one of the chief types that do the giving to get thing and the pushing, the push pull mechanism, and they do that out of the control of all that emotionality as a resource to produce some apparent proximity with that person. But it's, yeah.
Though maybe a little more push and a little less pull.
Yeah, correct. So it's more like I don't make myself available for you in your terms, and I do these things to attract you. It's like, pheromone coming from an animal. I will attract you for something, and then we're done. So and then the sexual five becomes the most picky of all types in terms of saying if you are the one or not. And that's because of avarice. So avarice is behind how much the sexual five makes it difficult for a relationship to work, and also avarice of creating only this very personal ways of exchanging intimacy and exchanging emotions. They are always my ways and not your ways. And fives in general are very imposing when it comes to just saying or allowing the relationship to be a certain way. They want to drive all the show and to be in charge of all of that. It's very uncomfortable for a five to allow the others to lead stuff. So avarice is behind all of that.
And I think with sexual fives too, there's like a intellectualization of what the ideal experience is. in relationship and a lot of desire for depth, like a big desire for depth, but then a lot of conditions that someone has to meet in order for them to be satisfied with both the relationship and the depth. And I think that's one way that sexual fives can get confused with fours is they really want a meaningful experience. They want to go very deep, not just with anyone, but with the right person in the right way. And there's a lot of control around how that happens.
Right. And I see that sexual fives be um they they look like they look like people who are very emotional, but actually they are emotional almost only in very indirect ways. It's very hard for them to express their emotions directly and confronting the other person and saying things in a very simple way without metaphors. So a great exercise, for instance, for sexual fives is to not allow themselves to use metaphors, to be direct,
Yes.
and to be really like plain, direct in what they are feeling. That would be less avaricious. So being indirect in the ways I feel and express my emotions is avarice.
So hopefully people are seeing some more nuances of what subtypes are and how they play out. And that this extended example of type 5, which I think has been very rich, gives a little more clarity into how different the subtypes can be, but how they all form these sort of subversions of the passion of the type, the central motivating emotional experience, and how it plays out differently depending on which of these three instincts is strongest, is dominant in the person's experience. Anything else you want to say to finish out this particular exploration of the definition and the importance of subtypes?
Just one last quick comment. Subtypes are deceitful. Deceitful in the sense that if I do that thing my subtype wants me to do, I'm deceiving myself in self deceit and deceiving you in ways that neither you or I will see the passion of my type. So it's a way to hide, really, behind a way of being that will not look like for fives, will not look like they are avaricious. Sometimes the self-pressed five is warm. Sometimes the social five is always all, sharing of information and teachings. Sometimes the sexual four feels warm and emotional, and that's all deceit because it's
The
there is
sexual
avarice
four or the
behind.
sexual
Sexual five, sorry.
sexual five?
Yeah, so I'm
Sexual
talking
five.
again about the same examples, saying that it's deceiving. Whatever we do with our subtypes is aiming to deceive and deceive. Like I will not see myself in that part of me that's called a passion, and you won't see that either.
So, I'll say one last thing from my part is I've been really shocked by how surprising the subtype aspect of ourselves can be to ourselves. I remember when I discovered mine, I'd been doing self-work for, 10 years or so. I'd been to 10 years of therapy. I'd been doing some pretty, not maybe the most in the world, the best self work in the world, but pretty good self work. And I was totally stunned by the new things I learned about myself, which I first wanted to fight about, resist knowing about when I learned my subtype. And I noticed that when you and I do work with people, there are a lot of times when it's really hard for us to help people see some of their subtype behaviors. In fact, people get mad at us, they fight with us, They never want to see us again. Sometimes when we point this out, of course, a lot of people very humbly and beautifully open up to seeing this in very powerful ways. But it's a part of ourselves that we really, I think, hide from ourselves behind a defense of seeing it as more positive, more functional, something we need to do to get by. But this subtype character, its patterns, the unconscious nature of it, is really, I think, what drives some of the most problematic forces in the world today. When we were talking about this, preparing for this podcast, you pointed out, but what about wars and abuses? Sometimes these are exactly the things that are caused by this unconscious part of ourselves that we don't want to see, and that we even fool ourselves into thinking is something functional and positive. So I think that's the last thing I want to say is how shocking this can be, which is another reason why I'm excited that we're doing this course on the subtypes, really focusing 9 or 10, 2 hours, 2 hours on each type, a course in the next weeks, really trying to focus in on exactly this kind of thing. If you liked what Uranio said about the type 5, join us as we talk about all 9 in the next 5 or 6 weeks, because this is such a crucial and central part of the Enneagram, and that's what we'll be doing more on, not only in that course, but probably in all the work we do upcoming. But any last thing before we stop?
Types course will also have very interesting film clips that you have been collecting to illustrate, the subtypes in new ways, not only in words. So join us.
Yes. All right. That's it for now. It's time for our top 5.
What is our top five today, B?
Today, our top 5 is what you see is what you get. No adjustment, no shape shifting, just who they are, what you see is what you get.
Not many hidden agendas, transparency. Yeah, so the way that we see them is pretty close to what they're bringing in the inside. So, what is your number five?
So, my number 5 is type 9, and I didn't put subtypes today, but with this one I did. A little more self-preservation 9 is my number 5. What about you?
The same. No, type 9. Yeah, I agree with you also that the self press is even more. Perhaps if it was only self press 9, it would be higher on my rank, but nines in general, I think, are reasonably like what you see is what you get. Because at times also, it's not that happens with nines. Like nines can keep smiling when they are thinking something bad about you, or they can say yes when they mean no. So that it's not completely what you see is what you get, but it's more than other types that didn't make to my list, so it's my number five. What is your fourth,
For position, I have type 7
and why?
because I think sevens are usually pretty authentic. Sexual sevens maybe have that extra thing of being naive, maybe naively authentic sometimes. I think they tend to present as who they are for the most part. I mean, certainly, I mean they're number 4 because I think sometimes they can be sort of intellectually charming, and so they can sort of be a little bit more positive than maybe they always feel inside. But yeah, I put 7 because I think for the most part, what you see is what you get.
Interesting. Yeah, I see your point. Maybe you're right. And I didn't have seven in my first five because I think that sevens don't show the difficult things that they are feeling, and they even stay with a good facade, like as if everything is right. But anyway, my number four is five. I think that fives are reasonably like what you see is what you get. Not completely. I think that many fives don't show much what they are feeling, and you can't sometimes tell that fives are feeling bad or even that they are feeling happy because they don't celebrate much. They are not enthusiastic. But I think at the same time, it's very hard for me, for instance, as a five, to pretend that I'm feeling something. I can do it just for a short time and not for a long time. Like, that thing that I was at a restaurant and I started being tired and then I slept at the restaurant. Do you remember that, B? It's a little bit what I mean by fives being a bit what you see is what you get. That there is not much commitment to sustaining an image, and it's hard to do that for a long time. So it's my number.
Right. Right. Interesting. For some reason, I didn't even consider fives for my list, but I think maybe that's because sometimes there's a lot going on that fives don't share. I totally agree with you. Fives don't put on a false front in any way. And if they're bored, they might even show it. If they want to leave, they might not hide it. But it's almost like still waters run deep, that saying. Like, I think there's a lot of depth there that sometimes they're not showing. But yeah, it's funny because I didn't even really consider that, but it also makes sense for the four position. Yeah.
What is your number three?
My number three is four. And this is because fours tend to value authenticity. I put a little notation by four around subtype, which is more social and sexual fours. I think sometimes self preservation fours can be a little more like twos and threes. They can put a little bit more on an image. I think often they're more conscious of doing it. They may not want to do it or may not like it. It may not feel comfortable, but sometimes I think they do it because they feel like they have to or because it's easier. So I was thinking a little more social and sexual for, but I sort of think that sometimes they're sort of they have a kind of courage to kind of be who they are, to say how they're feeling, even if they know that people won't like it or won't always be comfortable with it. So four was my in my three position. What about you?
Also four. And I agree with all you said and authenticity that comes from fours. And I actually don't have much to add to what you said.
Mhm.
So I'm suspecting that we have the other two right, but maybe not. Let's see. What is your second?
My second is type one.
Me too. I'm just going to announce it. Yeah, and why, B?
Wow. I'm surprised that I think this might be the first time in a while where we've had 4 out of 5 the same. Maybe if I mean, assuming our number 1 is
I almost convinced you to include fives, and you convinced me to include sevens. So yeah, but let's go. Why do you think one is very much what you see is what you get?
I think with ones, it doesn't even occur to them to sort of be other than who they are, say other than what they think. I think they tend to be very direct. They're not afraid to say if something's wrong with something or if they don't like something. Often that's part of their desire to make things better or call out things that aren't working or that they don't see as right. And you know what? It occurred to me. I've thought of some politicians that have run for high office and failed to attain that office. I think sometimes it's because they aren't good at putting on an image to sort of win over people. And I think sometimes because of that, because they feel awkward in that role, it's hard for them not to be who they are. I think sometimes people see them in negative ways, like being overly critical or overly serious or awkward and uncomfortable when trying to persuade people to vote for them because they're having to put on an image or tell people what they want to hear as a way of winning them over. And I just think that that's very hard for ones, and they just tend to be more who they are in a straightforward way.
I agree with everything. I won't add much. I would just say that sometimes ones, in my experience, are not like that, but just a few times, really. Like I've just done a session with a person who's a social one, and she was saying that she can be very critical of her employees and her peers, and not show that at all, because as a social one, she just becomes even better herself to model what she thinks other people should do and be. So that's not exactly what you see is what you get. But in all other cases, I think that ones are really transparent and clear and easy to read. In terms, there is not much indirect thing, and also it's very concrete, practical. So yeah, my number two, and I'm pretty sure that our number one is the same.
Yes, yes. Number one is type 8.
Yay. And why so?
Yeah. Yeah, I think eights are very authentic, very straightforward. I think they are who they are. It's really hard for them to pretend to be anything other than they are, and why would they? I just think that one of the things about eight sort of being fearless when it comes to being in the world is that they don't hide who they are for any reason. So yeah, I just think they tend to shoot from the hip, be honest and straightforward to a fault. So yeah, so that's type 8 was my number one. Anything you would add to that?
Kids can learn how to be less so, especially in some environments, but usually it's the hardest to learn that. And eights, many times, if they don't say anything, it's because everything is all right. Or if they say it all. And they are also very expressive in their faces and energy. So it's both what you see in a nonverbal way and what you hear. Everything sounds transparent, and eights really very rarely have hidden agendas. It's all open and said and stated. So I agree with that. And yeah, wow, we almost made it, in the lottery, like matching all five. We'll get there sometime.
Thank you for joining us. I hope you join us again next time for Enneagram 2.0, where we talk about all things Enneagram.